Chapter 22, and we're going to read at verse 1. I'll try to keep Mickey. Mickey's trying to keep me straight. But Genesis chapter 22, verse 1. Tonight I want to think about something. The boys asked me something this morning, and I believe it was Byron or Ethan, or they was both there together, so I'm going to use both of them. He looks up and says, "You're going to let us out tonight for the ball game, ain't you?" That was Byron, wasn't it, Ethan? Yeah, let's get it straight here. And I said, "Well, no, you're going to lay out. Was that the way it was? I was going to lay out to watch the ball game tonight." Okay. And I said, "No." I said, "Lord have mercy." I said, we grew up in our home, and of course, when I grew up, we didn't ask the blessing over the food or anything because my dad wasn't saved, and we wasn't practiced. So after we got married, and this is still a thing today, that we sit down to eat and somebody gets a big mouthful without asking the blessing. Billy said, "Hey, you just pray over there." And I look around and I'd say, "No." And they can say, "Well, I'll tell you what, I don't want to get choked. You better ask the blessing over this food." So all down through the years, this is the thing. Did you pray over it? Have you asked the Lord about it? If you're not careful, if you don't ask the blessing, you might get choked. So I told the boys this morning, I used that in reference, and I told them, I said, "Now boys, if we lay out to watch that game, Tennessee will lose." So here they are tonight. They're right here. I'm thankful. So maybe Tennessee will win tonight, okay? I thought I'd throw that in. But I thought about how a lot of times we're blessed. And we don't realize it. A lot of times we just take it for granted that God said what He promised He would do. And I want to use Abraham here for example. And let's go back. Let's go back in the Old Testament, and I thought about here, before Abraham's name was Abram. Everybody remember that? Abram. And Abraham had brothers. And God called Abram out of his country and told him to go into a promised land, a Canaan land. A land that he would bless and multiply the seed. And Abraham's brother had a son. His name was Lot. And because Abram and Sarah was childless, that his brother actually let him have his son, Lot, that was Abram's nephew, to go with him. And so when God called Abram out, and when He called him out, and He told him that He would bless him, don't you really think that God today still blesses? He's the same. And if we live for Him and we serve Him to the best of our ability, don't you know that God's not slack concerning His promises? That today, whatever God's wanting us to do, if we'll do it, don't you imagine that He'll still bless? But anyway, we're human. Just like Abraham. Can't you imagine, here he is, and he is still barren. They're still childless. Abram and Sarah. And even though they left their kindred, and they took with them their possessions that they probably could carry, didn't take all of them probably, and they went down to Canaan land. And Sarah was still barren. And Abram, listen friends, was still standing on the promise that God gave him, that I'll multiply multiply your seed, but they were no children. And then later, listen, friends, that Sarah gave Abraham one of her servants, Hagar, and she conceived and brought forth a child, and his name was Ishmael. Now, even though when the child was born, Sarah was very probably jealous or angry, and actually cast Hagar out. And the Lord, the angel came and told her to come back. And she come back, and she said, you go to Sarah and you tell her that you'll be a servant, whatever you want me to do. And that boy, Ishmael, began to grow. And because of the blessing that God told Abraham, God wasn't going to back up on that blessing because He had blessed his seed. And Ishmael, God began to bless and work. And even though Sarah was very jealous and very, I wouldn't say angry, but still she was jealous. And every time she'd look around and see him, I can imagine the jealousy that she had. And still barren, but one day, and this is the part that I want to get across, that one day that the Lord came and spoke to Abram and said, I'm going to change your name from Abram to Abraham. And then not only that, He said Sarah is going to conceive. And the Bible said that Sarah, up in years, Abraham being about 99 and Sarah way up there too, and she laughed because how can I bring forth a child in my old age? And she laughed, and the Lord knew what she done. And actually, she turns around, and Ishmael, that she ran Hagar and Ishmael off again. And God began to bless them because He had made a promise. And Ishmael was an archer. He could shoot a bow. And they was down in Egypt. And Ishmael took a wife, and they had 12 sons and one daughter. Now, Ishmael was by a bondswoman. And now Sarah is going to conceive, and Sarah is a free woman. And God was going to bless Abraham's seed by Sarah. And can't you imagine, here rose up actually two different types of people today, just like listen friends, we find this today, even in Israel. They're still over there praying and living under the law. Just like Ishmael was a type of the law. And just like Israel today, that's still praying for the Messiah to come. But yet, Isaac, the child that Sarah brought forth, listen friends, was by a free woman. And listen, and he was going to, this seed was by promise. And just like today, Isaac, and here's in verse 22 it tells what happened. And Abraham here is really challenged. Just like today, don't you imagine we're really challenged a lot of times? I think God don't tempt nobody with sin. But don't you think sometimes our faith is tried to see how much we don't walk by sight, friends. I want to tell you something. We walk by faith. Every day of our life when we get up, we can see the things that God does, but really we walk by faith. And we step out of that door. And by faith. And here's what happened to Abraham in 22 verse 1. And it came to pass after these things that God did tempt Abraham, and said unto him, Abraham, and he said, Behold, here am I. Oh, we need to be willing, just like Abraham, aren't we? I mean, when God speaks, listen friends, how many people are willing? How many people are called, but few are chosen? How many people, listen friends, how many young preachers do you see step out on faith anymore and say, God's called me to preach, or God's called me to do something? We don't hear that anymore, do we? Huh? Listen friends, I think that even though God here tempted Abraham and said unto him, Abraham, and he said, Behold, here am I. And he said, Take now thy son, thy only son Isaac, whom thou lovest. Remember, Isaac was by Sarah, a free woman. And get thee into the land of Moriah, and offer him therefore a burnt offering upon one of the mountains which I will tell thee of. Boy, I've heard a lot of people comment on that. I've heard a lot of people looks up and says that, and listen, friends, we may never face that. But can't you imagine Abraham with the son that him and Sarah brought forth way up in years and promised a free woman? And listen, friends, if we really look at it, here was Ishmael that was actually under the law. And here was Isaac actually under grace. A type and shadow of Jesus Christ. And think about it. And Abram, God was going to bless and multiply not only by the Israelite nation, but every nation under the sun. I'm going to multiply your seed. I'm going to bless your seed as the sands of the sea or the stars in the sky. I'm going to bless you, and I'm going to give you. Do you realize that if we're really obedient to what God says? Have you ever thought about what God has in store for us? And really, if we try and listen, if we'd really be obedient to what God said, don't you imagine with all the blessings that God has in store? And listen, friends, and He looks down and He knows what we need before we ask. But not only that, but He's willing, if we're willing to step in the gap and make up the hedge, the fields are already white for harvest, but not many are chosen today. And here He is asking him to take the son that they had been waiting on for so long. And God obeyed, and he obeyed God with not only taking him out on that day in circumcision, and here he is bringing him up and nourishing him in the way of the Lord, and God's saying, you take him out and you sacrifice. I want you to really see this tonight. Now, what Abraham stepped out to do. And Abraham rose up early in the morning and saddled his ass and took two of the young men with him, and Isaac his son, and cleaved the wood for the burnt offering, and rose up and went into the place of which God had told him, and showed him that place. Then on the third day, Abraham lifted up his eyes and saw the place afar off. And Abraham said to the young man, Abide here, ye here with the ass, and I and the lad will go yonder and worship and come again to you. And Abraham took the wood of the burnt offering and laid it on Isaac his son, and took the fire in his hand and the knife. And they went both of them together. And Isaac spake unto Abraham his father, and said, My father? And he said, Here am I, my son. And he said, Behold, the fire and the wood. But where is the lamb for a burnt offering? And Abraham said, My son, God will provide himself a lamb for a burnt offering. So they went both of them together. And he came to the place which God had told him of. And Abraham built an altar there, laid the wood in order, and bound Isaac his son, and laid him on the altar upon the wood. And Abraham stretched forth his hand, and took the knife to slay his son. And the angel of the Lord called upon him out of heaven, and said, Abraham, Abraham. And he said, Here am I. And he said, Lay not thy hand upon the lad, neither do thou anything unto him, for now I know that thou fearest God. Can't you imagine just think about going out and taking your son. And listen, friends, and even in my mind, and I'm going to say this, and I don't have a Bible to back it, but I really believe that Abraham knew that God would provide. I believe that God would spare his son Isaac, because he had told him that he was going to bless him. And like I say, God's not slack. But when he brought back the knife, the angel said, Abraham, Abraham, here am I. And to make the story a little shorter, I guess, that he turns around and there's a ram caught in a bush. And they took that ram and they slew it, and they sent a burnt offering up that day. And can't you imagine what joy that was? This morning we talked about the mystery that was revealed unto Paul. And can't you imagine the mystery that was revealed to Abraham? Here he brought forth two sons, Ishmael of the law, and Isaac, the new dispensation of grace, of faith. And listen, friends, and every time I read this, and every time I think about it, I think about what God really must have went through. Listen, friends, from the very point, and Isaac is a type and shadow of Christ. That actually they wasn't none worthy, but God looked, and there was his son. And he sent him down here in the form of flesh and blood, just like me and you. Tempted just like me and you. And listen, friends, but God knew the plan. God knew what was going to happen. That there'd been that his son would be a type of sacrifice for me and you. That we could have life and have it more abundantly. You realize that not only how many times that I'm asked the question about different things about death, and working at a funeral home, you really got a lot of questions about burial or about cremation or whatever, and everybody asks the questions all the time. And even a lot of times somebody come and they looked up and they asked me, said, Sam, how do I be saved? And of course, everybody knows that you'll turn around and say, hey, just like I did, I called upon the name of the Lord. I asked him to come into my life and be, save me and be in my heart. And listen, friends, and that love shines out today. Sacrifice was made. Some years ago, when Christ walked here, about 30-some years here on this earth, and all the miracles he had done, but he became the Lamb, the sacrificial Lamb, without spot or blemish for sacrifice. Ain't you glad today? I'm glad I'm saved. I just want it to be more like him. I just want to be more faithful. I want to be more willing to step out and do what God wants me to do. Has God ever spoke to you, maybe you passed somebody, or maybe you went by a house, or maybe one of your friends, and God said, hey, you go witness to them. You go tell them about this plan. And then you get about halfway up the road, and then you turn and go back, and you're really dreading to go talk to them, huh? And then you go in there, and you look and you say, hey, I want to invite you to church. I want you to be at church with me. I want you to go with me. And then after you do that, oh, you've got a smile big enough to eat a banana sandwich when you're really obedient. You ever do that? Maybe you do something? You know what? God's got a plan for us. Listen, friends, if we're willing to say, Lord, here am I. And it may not be what you think it might be. It may not be. Listen, friends, and I really believe that Abraham believed God. And I believe because of his belief, he feared God with a godly fear that if he did what God would ask him to do, that God would bless and be on the scene. I believe that today. Let us stand. You know this.